Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. Speaking of gaming, Kinich, a residential gamer, is now available in Genshin Impact 5.0. In this video, you'll learn everything you need to know in this ultimate guide for Kinich. This video was filmed on the Creator Experience server, and things are subject to change on release. Please check the comments down below to see if there are any notable changes on release. As usual with these guide videos, there's no time for Spider-Man jokes or Mega Man references due to how much we have to cover. So let's swing through his kit, blast away his artifacts and stats, Spidey sends out some weapons, team up with some robot masters, ruin Dr. Wily's budget with Constellations, and finally, my closing thoughts about Kinich in the meta and his future potential. Fortunately for me as a guide maker, his basic attacks are literally useless. Woohoo! We can move on to his elemental skill. Unfortunately for me, he has a modern elemental skill, which means you better like reading pages upon pages of stuff. Upon using his skill, Kinich enters Night Soul state and grapples onto a nearby enemy. He can perform loop shots, which are these pew-pews, where he strafes around the grappled enemy. And once his Night Soul bar is full with 20 Night Soul points, pressing the skill button will shoot his Mega Buster cannon. His Mega Buster cannon has a huge multiplier. At talent level 9, it's usually at 1168% or 1488%, depending on whether or not he has a stack of Night Soul burst. And needless to say, these Mega Buster cannon shots is where the majority of his damage output comes from. Both his pellets and his Mega Buster cannon count as skill damage. So how does he get Night Soul points to fire off his Mega Buster? Well, he gets 2 Night Soul points per second while he's in Night Soul state. He gets 3 Night Soul points per pew pew. He gets 4 Night Soul points per blind spot or triangle minigame, and a whopping 7 Night Soul points per burning/burgeon every 0.8 second. Triangle minigame, you ask? After grappling onto an enemy, he creates a triangle zone, aka blind spot, attached to the enemy that he has grappled. And if Kinich goes into this triangle zone, Kinich will gain 4 Night Soul points. This triangle appears to respawn on a randomish side of the enemy per Mega Buster cannon shot. And once you really break it all down, his goal is to just pew pew, try to grab some triangles, and then Mega Buster cannon whenever it's available. Without burning, Kinich can generally perform 2 to 3 Mega Busters. And with burning, most of the time he'll perform 4 Mega Busters, with 5 Mega Busters being possible. I was only able to do 5 Mega Busters a single time while testing him, but perhaps as players master him, 5 will eventually become the norm. But for now, 4 Mega Busters is the standard. Unfortunately, Kinich is able to re-grapple, so if an enemy dies or if the enemy moves out of range, he can quickly re-grapple a nearby enemy. Kinich also has Stellar Super Armor too. Finally, this 3-2-1 timer that appears over his head indicates how many seconds are left on his Night Soul burst state. Anyway, let's also rattle through a bunch of additional useful parameters of his skill. You can hold down his skill to aim at which enemy you want to lock onto. His cannon has usable, albeit smallish, AoE, which hits enemies that are close to each other. He generates 4 to 5 dendro particles on his first cannon shot. And his pew pew appears to have a time-gated ICD. His 18-second cooldown on his elemental skill begins when you use his skill. It has a 10-second duration, which can be extended by 1.7 seconds by using his elemental burst. And since his elemental burst animation takes 1.70 seconds, he actually doesn't lose valuable skill duration. If you swap during his Night Soul state, it will actually end his skill's duration and Night Soul state. Pew Pew will also trigger things like Xingqiu and Yelan's coordinated attacks, but it won't trigger Beto's burst. His cannon attack does not trigger Xingqiu or Yelan, and he can dash during his Night Soul state to reposition and dodge enemy attacks. Now before we move on to the next part of his kit, we also need to briefly talk about Kinich's Night Soul Burst mechanic. So what is Night Soul Burst? If you have any Natlan character in your party, and if literally any character in your party deals elemental damage, you'll see this full screen flash thing. The cooldown is shared party-wide, and the cooldown for having 1, 2, and 3 Natlan characters to perform a Night Soul Burst is 18, 12, and 9 seconds respectively. Each stack of Night Soul Burst provides him with 320% additional multiplier to his next cannon shot, stacking up to 2 times. His current teams will generally see this come into play once per rotation, although in the future, with more suitable Natlan teammates, we could see 2 or possibly even 3 Night Soul bursts per rotation. Here we can finally absorb Kinich's next power, his Elemental Burst, where he summons his mighty dragon Tamagotchi pet, Aho. This Dragon Tamagotchi performs 1 skill hit plus 6 lasers. The laser applies Dendro every other hit, and it doesn't snapshot. Again, using his burst actually extends his skill by 1.7 seconds, so this way you won't really have many issues getting 4 shots out. In fact, I find it actually makes it easier to get more shots out. His Elemental Burst is not integral to his kit, aka you don't really need to build energy recharge for it. This burst is perfectly fine to use every other rotation, even though its multiplier is pretty high at 1459.6% at level 9. While this might seem like a large multiplier, it actually makes up a rather small amount of Kinich's damage output. As we can see, his burst damage distribution is only 14.8%. So to summarize everything, for a basic rotation, have Pyro on the enemy, then use Kinich's elemental skill. I personally like doing 1 Pew Pew and then using his elemental burst if it's available. Then just use his cannon whenever possible. And while Pew Pewing, try to grab the triangles. You should be able to fairly consistently perform 4 cannon shots assuming the enemy is constantly burning. And maybe you can get 5 out if you're lucky and or are a hardcore gamer. For his talent priority, needless to say, you should level up his skill above all else, then his burst, and finally I guess his normals if you want to. Alright, and I almost forgot to talk about his exploration capabilities, but he feels amazing to explore with in Natlan. Being able to use 2 grappling hooks in a row would significantly reduce cooldown if he doesn't latch onto an enemy. He can also provide some additional movement speed via one of his exploration passives. However, outside of Natlan, his exploration feels mediocre, so there is that to keep in mind, but fortunately, we'll be spending a ton of time in Natlan for the next year or so to get the most out of his exploration capabilities, and along with his great damage capabilities, he's sure to give you a lot of mileage in the overworld. He also has the exploration passive which detects Natlan Ascension materials. Swinging on over to the next part of his guide, we have his stats and artifacts. For his main stats, it's the usual attack percent timepiece, usually a Dendro goblet, with an attack percent goblet being usable. And for the circlet, go for the crit circlet that best gives you the 1 to 2 crit ratio. This is usually going to be a crit rate circlet though, since Kinich's ascension stat happens to be crit damage. For his substats, as usual, it's crit rate and crit damage, then attack percent, followed by flat attack, and energy recharge doesn't hurt either. For the artifact set, it's clear that the 4-piece Obsidian Codex is the best in slot, providing 15% bonus damage plus 40% crit rate. Another good choice is the 4-piece Unfinished Reverie, and this is fine if you've already farmed a good set, but I think it's worth farming for the 4-piece Obsidian even if you have a good Unfinished Reverie. Now the 4-piece Marichowsi Hunter is mainly just recommended with Furina, although you can intentionally try to take burning damage, but Furina feels awkward to use with him. Still, because Kinich doesn't do any basic attack damage, the Marichowsi Hunter isn't really that great for him, being at only 90.7% of the Obsidian. So this is definitely a temporary option as you farm for the Obsidian Codex. Now funnily enough, the 4-piece Scroll of the Hero of the Cinder City can actually buff Emily's damage as well, which is really funny. But overall, I don't really recommend this unless you just got awful rolls on the 4-piece Obsidian while getting an extremely good 4-piece Scroll of Hero of Cinder City. Up next, we have the 4-piece Golden Troop and various 2-piece plus 2-piece combinations, which are usable stat sticks while you're farming the Obsidian. And we have the 4-piece Deepwood Memories, which is a solid choice, but you should really be using this on a teammate and not on Kinich. Up next, let's talk about his weapons. Earthshaker is definitely his go-to free-to-play option, and it's also one of the cooler looking free-to-play weapons. While on paper with a damage maximizer it does sheet a bit worse, in practice it felt better than what is sheeting here. This is because you can usually fish for crits on his cannon shots. Still, overall his signature weapon is obviously his best in slot option, with a huge base attack stat plus a bit of crit rate which allows Kinich to pragmatically reach 100% crit rate, 60% skill, skill and burst damage is tailor-made for him, and this thing provides him roughly a 29% increase to his full rotation's damage. Next we have Beacon of the Reed Sea, which is a solid stat stick, and you can damage yourself on purpose via burning. Verdict is okay, but you'll want a Geo teammate, which is honestly a bit awkward. Still, I calculated 1 stack on average here. The Unforged is an interesting choice. Kinich doesn't really need a shielder, but if you do have a shielder with him, it's a very reasonable option providing a ton of attack. The Wolf's Gravestone is of course usable as always, but has major uptime issues. When it's down, it's about as good as the Earthshaker, but it will, as always, do good when its buff is up. As we can see, these 5-star stat sticks are decent choices, although not humongous improvements over the Earthshaker. Now the Refinement 5 Serpent Spine is a great option, significantly outperforming the Earthshaker, but not only do I dislike waiting 16 seconds in between each and every attempt, it's hard without a shielder to keep its passive up. If you're fine with these restrictions and have a highly refined Serpent Spine, then as always it's a great option. Without refinements, and especially without stacks, it's a rather lackluster choice. The Red Horn is just a stat stick, and since its passive is actually completely useless, it doesn't really do very well here, but it's usable and it looks cool. So here's the full chart, which I've done some calcs for a bunch more weapons, but I don't feel like any of them are really worth talking about, since at this point, my advice is to just use the Earthshaker instead of the weapons below this point. But here's the full chart anyway. So we've reached the part of the video with the worst retention. So here's a clip of Kinich practicing his pew-pews. Upgrading from his free-to-play Earthshaker to his signature weapon leads to a substantial 29.2% increase to his overall damage output. Although while I was personally testing this, it didn't really feel like it. Anyways, Constellation 1 is an incredible constellation because it adds a whopping 100% crit damage on his cannon, which also helps him front load more of his damage. His Constellation 2 is pretty darn broken, providing 30% danger resistance shred, but also more AoE and 100% bonus damage on his first cannon shot per skill use. Considering his first cannon shot also has the 1 stack from his Night Soul Burst mechanic, this massively front loads his damage, making his Constellation 2 even better. Now if you were to ask me, should you go for his Constellation 1 or Refinement 1, personally I would go for his Constellation 1, as it's a similar damage gain while also providing 30% movement speed, and it opens up the possibility of getting his Constellation 2, which is a very powerful constellation, allowing him to front load a ton of damage. His Constellation 3 adds 3 levels to his skill, which is nice, although it's a bit diluted by his Night Soul Burst passive. Constellation 4 gives a bit of energy and burst damage, Constellation 5 gives 3 levels to his burst, and Constellation 6 is pretty darn broken, as his Mega Buster now bounces. And yes, it does work against one target, as the additional bounce will just bounce and then hit that one target. By Constellation 6 Refinement 5, his first cannon shot deals around 4.5 times the amount of damage of a C0R1 Kinich, which now allows him to be an exceptional front-loaded nuker. Now before we start building teams for him, we need to ask how important is burning for Kinich to consider for team building. Well, looking at his chart, we can see that it's very important. The difference between a 2 cannon shot no burning situation and a 5 cannon shot optimal burning situation is nearly twofold. Although do keep in mind that it's, at least for me, it was very difficult to get 5 cannon shots. Anyway, let's talk about the elephant in the circle, Bennett. Kinich actually has solid synergy with Bennett, as he's able to weave in and out of Bennett's circle to have solid uptime on Bennett's buff. Still, this circle impact is a major restriction and can feel pretty bad in many situations. Personally, I'm hoping for there to be a Bennett alternative in the future. But for now, Bennett is definitely one of Kinich's best teammates. And currently, because he doesn't have his final team yet, his teams are actually somewhat flexible. Let's start with a free-to-play friendly team. The first team has Bennett, Xiangling, and a flexible 4th character, as long as they can use the Deepwood memories. For example, Kalei or even Fischl can be solid choices. Xiangling is here to ensure that the enemy is pretty much always burning, and as such, the 4th team slot is somewhat flexible, although I would personally avoid Hydro. The next team has even lower build requirements with a Thrilling Tales of a Howl Slayer user, generally Yanfei or Klee. Having 2 Pyro plus 2 Dendro is a great way to have no issues with burning uptime and requiring literally only Kinich and to a certain extent Bennett to be properly built, as the other 2 characters are literally just a Thrilling Tales and Deepwood Memories dispenser. Another great Pyro teammate to complement Bennett is Dea. Dea can use either the Deepwood or the Tenacity with the Sacrificial Greatsword. She can also shorten down his rotations down from 20 seconds with Xiangling to 18 seconds assuming the Sacrificial Greatsword procs for Dea. Needless to say though, Emily is one of his best teammates, as she is also designed around burning, deals very solid damage, and has very low field time. Also, needless to say, very few people actually have Emily, and Kinich is perfectly usable without Emily. Now, Furina is an interesting option who does sacrifice burning uptime for more bonus damage, and she herself provides a good amount of damage. Xiangling though is highly recommended with Furina to maintain burning on the enemy, as well as either another Dendro like a healer like Baizu or Yao Yao. This is a good team for Kinich on his release, but I don't think it will stay as one of his best teams in the future. Still, a perfectly solid release day temporary team. Another surprisingly usable team is a Hyperbloom team, with Raiden being the preferred Hyperbloom activator since Kinich moves around and at quite the distance, so Kuki isn't very reliable. Because there is no burning or reliable burning in this team, Kinich will only be able to get 2 to 3 cannon shots. But Hyperbloom by itself is already able to 9-star many Abyss 12s, so yeah, this team is still a reasonable choice on release. But obviously, we're not fully utilizing Kinich's abilities here, and there are better Hyperbloom drivers than Kinich. Finally, we have Burgeon. I was personally disappointed with Burgeon's performance, but perhaps it can be good with the right setup. I just personally didn't find a good one. But still, there is some potential here. So what do I think about Kinich? Kinich is already a very solid burning-based DPS character. It's clear to me that Kinich, along with Emily, will be integral to a powerful burning-focused team. Frankly, the team is just missing the perfect Pyro character for Pyro application and potentially some additional buffs. Despite this though, he is a very solid character even without Emily, and he'll be an incredible character once he gets his full team. At least those are my predictions, which could be completely wrong, but hopefully not. Alright, there is also a bit of jank with his kit, but he does feel less janky than Molani and Kachina. But like his Natlanian brethren, with high mobility and an overly complex elemental skill comes some elemental jank. Still, while mildly annoying at times, I found him to be very fun and enjoyable to use, with some great damage output and a lot of style. Overall, it's hard to go wrong with Kinich if you need a main DPS character and if you like what you see. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.